What's up, everyone? Very honored to be here. My name is Maurice, and I go by Xprsn. Today, I'll be sharing the introduction and part 1 of my multi-part work titled Religion, the Oldest Psyop, a re-examination of spiritual narrative. My Instagram and YouTube channel are on the screen, and if you want more of my thoughts, feel free to follow or stalk me, whatever floats your boat. My main focus in life is spreading truth in forms that come to me. I am a father, a husband, a hip-hop soul artist, and the author of Culture Control: Why the Love of Money is Objectively the Root of All Evil. I make a lot of mistakes. I love hard as fuck, and I create seriously. I take my creations very seriously. It's honestly a dream of mine to one day share a space with Mark Passio, and want to give a real shout out to Cynthia Mitchell, Derek B., and my wife Tensi for helping me get where I am today. What you're about to hear is not an attack on faith by any means, and it's not an attempt to tell anyone to believe what I believe. It's my attempt to look at the oldest spiritual stories through a psychological and objectively moral lens, and ask how they shape the way we think, obey, fear, and care. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening with an open mind, and thank you for giving me your time. Let's get into it. Religion, the Oldest Psyop, a re-examination of spiritual narrative. Introduction. If I were to write a truly meaningful research paper, I would tell a story. And if I were to paint the greatest painting, it would be the story carried within it that gave it power. Meaning does not reside in data, nor does it arise from isolated facts. Across cultures and centuries, humans have agreed on one thing. It is better to have a meaningful life than merely a long one, to have a meaningful relationship than just a safe one, and to endure a meaningful struggle rather than a comfortable void. Meaning comes from the storyteller within. The inner storyteller. The most powerful force beneath awareness is not belief, not emotion, not even intention. It is the inner storyteller. Awareness simply is. The I am, which is known as the seed of consciousness, knows that isness. Below the I am sits the third seat, which is more powerful than all below it, the inner storyteller. The I am knows that it is, and the inner storyteller explains what that means. It interprets existence, gives shape to experience. It decides whether pain is punishment or lesson, whether fear is danger or invitation, whether obedience is virtue or surrender. Long before a person forms a religion, a worldview, a personal political identity, the inner storyteller is already writing. This storyteller is not the ego, because it tells the story of the ego and its evolution. It is not the emotions, because it gives them and their changes meaning. It is not the body, because it narrates the body's sensations and responses. It is the bridge between raw awareness and lived identity. It speaks in images, memory, myth, and anticipation. It works while we are awake and while we are asleep. It shapes the brain's wiring while the conscious mind is distracted. It decides which experiences become scars and which wisdom. And this precisely is why religion works. Not because it is true or false in some absolute sense, but because it hijacks the inner storyteller. It inserts a pre-written narrative into the most powerful meaning engine a human possesses. It tells the inner storyteller who the enemy is, what obedience means, what fear should look like, and where guilt should land. It does not merely give rules. It gives a plot. Heroes and villains, chosen and rejected, saved and damned, rewarded and punished, paradise and exile. See, once the storyteller accepts the plot, the nervous system, the subconscious mind, even the eternal soul follows. This is why karma feels delayed. Not because consequence is slow, but because story takes time. Consequence does not arrive as a lightning bolt. It arrives as a chapter. And chapters require context. A behavior does not mature into meaning until the narrative is complete enough to be understood. This is not determinism. It is interpretation. The story is not fixed per se, but it must be coherent for the lesson to land. Even repentance needs a storyline to work. And this is also why entire civilizations can repeat the same tragedies with new costumes and new customs over and over and over again. The inner storyteller of humanity has been trained to recycle the same script: fear, authority, obedience, abuse, collapse, forgetting, and repeat. New flags, new gods, new slogans, same plot. Religion, when weaponized, becomes the oldest psychological operation because it does not control behavior directly, it controls meaning. It teaches people to narrate exploitation as righteousness, submission as holiness, suffering as virtue. It trains the storyteller to look inward for sin instead of also looking outward for coercion and manipulation. It turns conscience into a private burden instead of a public alarm. And once that happens, control no longer needs chains. It only needs repetition. This is not because humans are unintelligent. It is because the inner storyteller is powerful enough to override the senses, alter memory, and survive contradiction. It can hold two opposing ideas at once if the story requires it. It can forgive the tyrant and condemn the neighbor. It can sanctify violence and shame gentleness. It can call cages protection and call rebellion evil. It is not bound by the rules it interprets. That is its danger and its miracle. The inner storyteller can enslave, and it also can liberate. When it is no longer fed dogma, it begins to observe cause and effect honestly and carefully. When it stops worshiping authority blindly, it starts respecting reality genuinely. When it releases fear as its central plot device, it can finally tell a new story, one where responsibility replaces obedience, where care replaces compliance, and where freedom is not the absence of restraint, but instead the presence of alignment. Religion at its worst programs the storyteller to fear truth, at its best, points beyond itself to underlying principles. And every psyop fails the moment the inner storyteller awakens to truth. Furthermore, the brain does not simply process facts, it organizes meaning through narrative. Stories literally alter neurological pathways. They shape memory, identity, emotion, and expectation. We use stories to make sense of our trauma, our joy, our health, in all of its dimensions: physical health, mental, emotional, spiritual, and the consequences of both our individual and collective choices. Stories are the backbone of humor, the soul of great music. They are the engine of marketing, where testimonials and narratives outperform raw data because they reach the body and the emotions, not just the intellect alone. This is why storytelling is considered one of the highest skills a culture can master. While the body changes, emotions evolve, and personalities shift, the story simply continues. It is the vessel that carries transformation. A Christmas story, a re-examination. The most influential story in the world is the story of Jesus Christ, Yeshua the Christ. It has crossed languages, continents, and empires. It has shaped laws, families, and inner lives. Because of this, it deserves neither blind loyalty nor casual dismissal, but serious re-examination. What follows is an intentionally dense inquiry into religion, with particular attention given to Christianity, not because it is uniquely flawed, but because it is the tradition I know most intimately. This work does not mock belief, nor does it treat faith as foolish. It attempts something more difficult, which is to distinguish between living truth and inherited narrative, between spiritual insight and psychological control, between moral awakening and moral outsourcing. It assumes that religion contains truth, deep truth, but also that truth can be weaponized when fused with authority, fear, and ritual. The danger is not falsehood alone. It is truth embedded inside systems designed to manage behavior. Perspective versus perception. For the purposes of this work, religion is defined very broadly as any faith-based idea that has the potential to hold one back from truth. This includes formal religions, political ideologies, scientific absolutism, culture, and inherited identity narratives of all kinds. Belief itself is, of course, unavoidable, and I do not have anything negative to say about someone's belief or someone's belief in the Bible as legitimate gospel. Human beings must orient themselves toward meaning. Still, belief becomes dangerous when it cannot grow, when it punishes questioning, and when it replaces lived understanding with obedience. This inquiry rests on an uncomfortable premise. Human history does not repeat because we fail to remember facts, but because we fail to understand cause. The same psychological pattern, fear, hierarchy, obedience, indulgence, and avoidance, produce the same outcomes under different names and costumes year after year. Natural law does not negotiate with empires or adapt to ideology. It responds only to behavior. So, when coercion and submission return, so do their consequences. One of the most potent tools used to maintain submission is called controlled opposition, approved channels of dissent that preserve the system they appear to oppose. Religious institutions have often served this function, not by inventing evil, but by redirecting moral outrage away from power and into ritual, identity, and inward guilt. In doing so, they separate cause from effect. The true sources of harm, coercion, exploitation, systemic violence, manipulation, deception, fade into abstraction, while the individual is trained to believe he himself is to blame for wounds created by the world. This produces a tragic inversion. Conscience becomes the enemy. Restraint is confused for repression, indulgence for freedom. Over time, people learn to resist the truth and therefore their own awakening more fiercely than any external tyrant ever could. The most effective form of control is not force, but consent. Not chains, but habit. Not silence, but stories. And the aim of this work is not to destroy religion, nor to enthrone cynicism, nor to replace belief with just sheer bitterness. It is to recover alignment, to examine where our oldest stories have helped us grow, and where they may have been shaped into tools of fear and obedience. It is to unlearn what blocks truth and preserve what reveals it. It is to approach spirituality not as inherited doctrine, but as lived responsibility. You see, when religion is frozen, it becomes limitation. Simultaneously, when truth is lived, it becomes freedom. So again, what follows is not an attack on faith. It is a refusal to confuse faith with surrender or love with blind obedience. It is an attempt to listen again to conscience, to consequence, and to the quiet intelligence already present in every heart. Part 1, the contradiction. There is almost no greater spiritual narrative than the sacrifice of Christ. Even if a person approaches it as literature alone, without doctrine, without church, without the pressures of identity, it still holds as one of the clearest images of moral courage ever handed to the human mind. A man sent from the highest realm refuses to become what is done to him. A man holds the line against fear, against coercion, against the seduction of hatred, against temptation. A man chooses truth over self-preservation, love over retaliation. And whether one reads this story as historical, symbolic, or both, it carries a frequency that does not easily fade. Yet, what I have come to believe is that many people have confused the living heart of that narrative with the institutional machinery that later formed around it. Christianity as a religion, as an empire-aligned structure, as a hierarchy of recruitment and enforcement, was not built by Christ. Christ did not preach a theology of domination. He did not authorize a class of moral police. He did not teach men to threaten non-believers with eternal punishment as though the divine creator needed human mouthpieces to do his disciplining. He did not confuse personal faith with a license to govern, punish, recruit, or coerce. What he brought was not a new technique of control. It was a moral inversion in a good way. Not the inversion of truth, but the inversion of the old reflex humanity perpetuates to this day. The reflex to conflate violence with virtue, domination with order, fear with wisdom, exclusion with purity, and identity with devotion. Christ, representing the truth, the way, and the life, reserves those instincts at their root. He points to an inner law instead of an external whip. He points to conscience instead of tribe, mercy instead of jealousy. He points to the sacredness of human beings not because of their bloodline, but because of their being. And this is where the psychological material becomes unavoidable for anyone who is honest. Now, we will circle back to Christ shortly because his arrival in this biblical story represents the most profound interruption of the old way in human moral history. Yet, even that interruption was eventually rewritten into a story that affects the inner storyteller in a very specific way. What began as a radical disruption of fear-based hierarchy was slowly recast into a narrative that made room for hierarchy again. What began as an awakening was turned into an institution, and what began as a call to conscience was transformed into a system of obedience. This is not because Christ failed, but because stories can be captured. The same truth that exposes domination can be recognized to justify it. The same teachings that dissolve fear can be framed to sanctify it. Once Christ is placed inside a controlled narrative, complete with authorities, rituals, enemies, and rewards, the inner storyteller is guided away from lived alignment back towards a submission. The plot shifts subtly from become free, become like me, to be loyal. Goes from see clearly to believe correctly. And in this way, even truth itself can be used as raw material for control. Asymmetrical protections and punishments. When I trace the story as it unfolds from the earliest pages of the Bible, I see a pattern that resembles the architecture of modern psychological operations. The slow normalization of hierarchy, favoritism, and othering, disguised as divine order. And I say this carefully. I'm not saying everything is false. I'm not saying there is no truth in the ancient texts. There is truth, often piercing truth. But there is also a recurring pattern of moral asymmetry that plants the seeds of division. And division is always the first ingredient in domination, as you'll see. Consider the earliest scene that sets the tone for the human being, the Garden of Eden. Most people I know have never heard a serious pastor or theologian say plainly that God did not create the serpent. And why would they? The text itself points to a creator of all things. If all means all, then the serpent is not a glitch. In fact, hell itself, with all of its inhabitants, would fall under all things in and of itself. The serpent is not an outsider who slipped past divine awareness. There is no clean theological escape from that implication. Now, this means the serpent is not an outsider, but a part of the system directly designed for human beings to have dominion over. And this is what the inner storyteller is given to take note of. The first moral conflict in the entire biblical narrative with human beings begins under a strange shadow. A being known as the serpent with the capacity to deceive, the intelligence to manipulate, and the ability to speak directly to the newly formed humans who possess no experience, no moral memory, and clearly no defense, is placed within arm's reach of said humans. The consequences are immediate and everlasting: the fall of man. Psychologically, the imprint is unmistakable. The story introduces chaos, temptation, and psychological warfare, not as accidents, but as baked into the arena itself. And then comes a distribution of blame. The serpent tempts the humans. The humans fall. God responds, gives punishments. The pattern that enters the human mind is asymmetrical. It's not clean. It's not what one would expect if the primary aim were moral clarity. When one is unable or unwilling to ask what deep identification with these short, powerful stories actually does within us, how they shape the automations of the inner storyteller, responsibility becomes tangled with worthiness. Causality becomes blurred. The inner storyteller absorbs a dangerous lesson, which is that manipulation and temptation exist under divine permission. But failure is carried by the vulnerable. That chaos can be present by design, yet guilt belongs to the inexperienced. That the system allows deception, but condemns those who are deceived. This trains the mind to expect moral imbalance, to accept uneven accountability, and to internalize fault for conditions it did not create. What kind of worldview gets trained into the human psyche when divine narratives introduce asymmetry at the very beginning? What happens when cause and effect feel selectively applied? What happens when punishment appears uneven? What happens when the mind learns very early that authority can create the conditions for failure, then punish the failure, and call the entire process righteous? Sacrificial lamb, or sacrilege of the damned. This is the same psychological pattern modern institutions use to sustain control, manufacture the environment, engineer the outcome, and moralize the consequences. It is a soft form of domination, and it becomes stronger when it is sacralized. From there, this pattern intensifies as we move through the biblical story. We move quickly into a story of sacrifices, favoritism, and this is where the moral logic becomes even more psychologically potent. Paradise was given freely as a gift. Then suddenly, offerings are introduced. First fruits, then livestock, blood. A creator beyond time and space, who needs nothing, is portrayed as pleased by some offerings and displeased by others. And not only displeased, this displeasure becomes the trigger for the first murder between siblings, between brothers. Here again, it is not the mere fact of the story that matters. It is the conditioning it can produce when treated as divine instruction. Because once you normalize sacrifice as a currency of approval, you have done something devastating to the human mind. You introduce the idea that destruction can be holy. You've introduced the idea that murder can be righteous. That a being can be harmed for a higher good, and that a higher authority desires that harm. Once that door opens, it never closes. A psyop always begins with the smallest acceptable concessions. And once the mind accepts the first concession, a lamb is only a lamb, it's only a lamb. A bull, it's only a bull. Then it becomes easier to accept the next, and the next, and the next. Those who resist sacrificing are resisting God. Those who resist become demonized, labeled impure, labeled dangerous. Their dissent becomes not a difference of conscience, but a threat to divine order. And this is how Gentile becomes more than just a word, but a mental box. And the box becomes hereditary. And the hereditary identity becomes destiny. And destiny becomes justification. This is not just ancient history, by the way. It is the blueprint of how human societies manufacture in-groups and out-groups and call that whole process morality. Soon enough, the narrative of divine favor narrows. The favor that once seemed broadly available becomes increasingly selective, increasingly lineage-based, increasingly tied to inheritance and identity. Noah is chosen to build the ark, to move the story forward. Then Abraham. Then only a select set of Abraham's sons. And then Jacob instead of Esau and Israel. Then the chosen people, and this becomes a theological identity. The structure becomes insiders and outsiders, holy blood and common blood, covenant members and those outside of the covenant. And if you want to watch moral relativism become institutional, watch what people can justify once they believe their tribe is the vessel for divine favor. A man can do almost anything if he believes the order of heaven is behind him. And that's why the story becomes psychologically combustible, because now the moral code is no longer anchored in universal conscience. It becomes anchored in status. It's anchored in selection. It's anchored in us. And us is always hungry. Us always needs an enemy to remain coherent. Us always needs outside to protect inside. Us always becomes a bit of a machine. And you can see how this escalates historically without even needing to argue theology. Once the mind accepts that a so-called chosen people even exists, and that the rest are somehow lesser, it becomes a small step towards things like slavery, conquest, and theologies that justify senseless violence. It becomes a small step to genocide framed as a sacred cleansing, a small step towards racism justified through eugenics, revisionist history, and sacred narrative. And of course, the final forms differ by era, but the mechanism is very stable. Identity replaces conscience, and harm becomes righteous through justification of divine favor. A moral earthquake. Now here is where Christ re-enters the story, but now like an interruption, a moral earthquake. Because Christ does not reinforce this narrowing pattern. He reverses it. Christ does not teach that divine relationship is about your bloodline. He completely dissolves bloodline. He does not teach that divine favor is inherited through tribe. He completely detaches it from tribe. He does not teach that separation from the others is righteous. He moves toward the others. He does not teach that righteousness is domination. He exposes domination as spiritual sickness. He does not teach that sacrifice is what makes you worthy. He teaches mercy, humility, and inner transformation. He does not teach that your enemies are evidence of your holiness. Instead, he teaches love for enemies is evidence of your alignment. This is a narrative inversion, a psychological liberation from the old way, where the earlier arc often conditions the mind towards hierarchy, towards chosen and unchosen. Christ conditions the heart towards universality. What you do unto others, you do unto yourself. Not because the tribe says so, but because reality is woven that way. Not because you must obey, but because it's true. This is natural law in human form. The price of certainty, sacred confusion. What one also finds within traditional Abrahamic religions is not merely error or manipulation, but a complicated mixture, contradiction, contradictory actions attributed to God, alongside undeniable truth. In fact, many aspects of these religions contain lasting truth, which is precisely why discernment becomes so difficult. If these systems were entirely false, they would be a lot easier to abandon. The danger is not obvious deception. It is truth wrapped in word magic, obscured by ritual, authority, and fear. It is the presence of genuine insight alongside moral incoherence that traps the mind. A person senses something sacred, something real, and assumes, therefore, that everything attached to it must also be sacred and true. To navigate this landscape requires a level of honesty and courage that most belief systems quietly discourage. Because the structure of belief itself is often tied to identity, belonging, and survival. Questioning becomes psychologically expensive, especially when the promise of another paradise, called heaven, is placed in the winner's circle, allegedly reserved for the most loyal, most obedient, and least questioning among the faithful. The message is subtle, but very powerful. Certainty is rewarded. Doubt is sometimes punished. Curiosity becomes rebellion. And the mind learns to protect the story rather than seek the truth behind it. See, this is where the concept of childlike faith becomes not merely misleading, but spiritually dangerous. Even in its most charitable, most sophisticated, nuanced interpretation, childlike faith is still the acceptance of something not rooted in lived truth. It cannot be grounded in truth, at least not the truth the observer inhabits. If the belief must be forced, imagined, or adopted unnaturally, it simply cannot be so. A faith that demands the suspension of conscience, the silencing of questions, or the denial of observable contradiction is not truth, it is submission. It's not openness, it's psychological retreat. In practice, childlike faith means either willful ignorance or unacknowledged doubt. The believer may not consciously lie to themselves, but they learn to look away from what does not fit. They learn to call discomfort things like tests. They learn to call moral confusion mystery. With this, faith becomes performance. Belief can become armor and used to block the truth. And the very intelligence that could lead a person closer to God can be trained instead to defend an image of God, which is not true, and which cannot survive honest examination. Childlike faith in contradictory claims does not lead to paradise, it leads to confusion. It leads to submission and the outsourcing of moral responsibility. It teaches people to wait for culture to tell them what is right, rather than listening to the conscience that already knows. And when obedience replaces understanding, even sincere people can be led to commit harm while believing they are doing good. History is not filled with simply monsters who thought they were evil. It's filled with a lot of ordinary people who thought they were righteous. The inner law. Where the Old Testament commands and requests from God often condition the human mind towards moral relativism. It's right because my authority says it's right. Christ shifts morality back towards conscience or the inner law. The living law. The law that does not require recruitment, threats, or enforcement rituals. The law that cannot be outsourced without degrading the soul. This is why I hesitate to call Christ merely a Jewish teacher or religious teacher in the way people casually mean it. He taught in context, yes. He spoke the language of the people, yes. He used familiar texts and symbols, yes. But to reduce his teaching to the structures he was actually confronting is to miss the heart of what he brought to the human family. He did not preach, "My tribe is superior." He preached a kingdom that is not built on tribal power, that lives in you. He did not preach obedience to unjust authority as righteousness. He confronted unjust authority, religious, economic, and political, without becoming unjust himself. And that is the higher miracle, in my view. He refused to return evil for evil. He refused to become a mirror of the system. He refused to bend the knee. And he did not just oppose tyranny, he refused to embody it himself. And this is why the moral inversion of Christ is so important to me. It's the antidote to the ancient and modern disease of domination disguised as care. Because domination always dresses itself as morality, right? It always claims higher purpose. It always insists that coercion is compassion. It always tells you this harm is necessary. The ends justify the means. The enemy is subhuman. So your obedience for your protection is your salvation. But that's wrong. And Christ's worldview refuses that at every turn. The polar opposite. Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion often occupy the opposite pole, what might be called the left of the spiritual spectrum. Less obsessed with obedience, more concerned with harmony. Less focused on punishment, more focused on awareness. Now, that side has its own distortions and dangers, but the contrast to the Abrahamic religions is instructive, where one side tends toward domination in the name of righteousness, the other toward dissolution and detachment in the name of peace. Now, personally, I think Christ does not fit into either category neatly. He seems to stand out of this spiritual political spectrum entirely, not as an institution and definitely not as a ruler, but as a living contradiction to systems that require fear, violence, unquestioning loyalty, or confusion to survive. In studying Eastern spiritual philosophy, one inevitably comes across a concept that Westerners may at first glance describe as lazy and naive. This concept has many names. I'm going to call it the concept of doing nothing. It, of course, is not truly a do-nothing instruction for one's lifestyle, but it means to do nothing that creates the illusion of you being separate from nature, rather than in nature. So when I say do nothing in this context, I mean basing your movements on the here and now, completely fresh, with a sense of oneness and symmetry with nature, without identity as other than nature. Simply put, doing nothing out of the flow of nature. And this approach offers a powerful solution to many day-to-day problems and even some complex ones, especially within the overstimulated and artificial environments of modern city life in the West. However, of course, East or West, this also becomes very impractical when applied dogmatically to all situations. There are moments when the greater good demands bold, decisive action, and to ignore that inner call in the name of perpetual non-interference is in itself a form of avoidance, and therefore its teaching a form of control. Flow, taken to an extreme, can become paralysis. And this raises an enduring question. What is the balance between doing nothing and using one's gift of intelligence to honor one's gift of creativity, particularly in relation to desire, which can itself also be a gift? Now, no one can act on every desire that they have without severe consequences, often traumatic and sometimes fatal. So a meaningful life therefore requires a substantial measure of restraint, of doing nothing. Yet discovering the balance between restraint and action appears to be one of humanity's oldest and most elusive challenges, understood clearly by only a few. The truth here is simple. Religion alone, of any kind, is insufficient to lead a person to goodness, which is synonymous with truth. What is required is direct, lived experience, the ongoing work of undoing, unlearning, and refusing to relapse into harmful patterns. No doctrine can replace the intelligence of born awareness, and no belief can substitute for the responsibility of conscious action. This is where my definition of religion becomes essential. Religion, as I use the word, is any faith-based idea that has the potential to hold a person back from truth. It is not limited to churches or scriptures. It includes political ideologies, scientific absolutism, moral posturing, and the worship of authority. Belief is unavoidable, but belief systems become religious in the harmful sense when they cannot evolve with growth, when they demand loyalty over honesty, and when they punish questioning or forbid conscience from speaking. A person can use imperfect traditions to grow closer to God. It happens all the time. I have met religionists on both the religious left and the religious right who deserve my respect. Not because they're right, but because they are sincere, humble, and most of all, not interested in recruiting or controlling others. They live their path instead of policing someone else's. They don't demand agreement to grant dignity to their fellow human being. And that kind of faith is not tyranny. It is a tool towards truth in their personal stories. But the religion of domination, the religion that cannot change with growth, is inorganic. And it is not a true relationship with the divine. It's a behavioral limitation structure. And that brings me back to the modern mirror, the systems of our time that do not call themselves religion, but function exactly like them. Whether or not someone believes texts like silent weapons for quiet wars are literal, the pattern is visible. Control shifting from overt violence to subtle conditioning, from explicit hierarchy to automated compliance, from priests to institutions, and from fear of hell to fear of instability. In both cases, the goal is the same: outsource conscience, normalize obedience, train the population to police itself. So the question becomes not merely theological, but psychological. Are we oriented towards truth or toward control? And a deep examination of the phenomenon called addiction may help clarify this a little more. The chemistry of avoidance. Addiction is not merely chemical dependency or moral failure. It is a feedback loop born of misalignment. And it begins with something that feels freedom aligned, a thought dressed as curiosity, empowerment, relief. A thought disguised as an assertion of curious autonomy, but is truly just avoiding the pain, cruelty, and chaos of this wicked world we inhabit. We say, oh, this isn't gonna hurt anybody, and I deserve to have a little fun. And that initial turn quickly hardens into denial. That denial eventually becomes bondage. Now, at that stage, one may be able to admit the addiction, yet still feels quite powerless to stop. The mind becomes entangled in its perceived dependence on external source of stimulation. The body in its perceived dependence on chemical reward. All the while, the spirit, which is subtly pulling you away, is being drowned out by the body and mind noise. The same thing happens at the collective level. Societies become addicted to power, control, consumption, domination, and they call it necessity when they can't kick the habit. The remedy is the same: more honesty, more restraint, responsibility, true care. Not punishment, not merely coercion toward alignment, but alignment to truth. And alignment to truth is where Christ, to me, becomes less a religious symbol and more a moral compass. Not the idol of a system, but the example of a human being who refused to let fear become his God. One who showed that truth can stand unarmed before empire and still be truth. And that's why I'm very careful, but also quite firm. I do not need to insult my Christian brethren to say what I see. I do not need to mock scripture to acknowledge its fractures. And I do not need to claim certainty where humility is required. But I also refuse to pretend that the psychological material is not there. The arc from sacrifice and favoritism to exclusion and hierarchy is not invisible. Do unto others. The inversion Christ offers is not subtle, and the consequence of confusing the two, of turning Christ's moral vision into an institution of control, have been written into human history in blood. If humanity seeks a greater harmony, there are some principles we must strive for perfection in. The golden rule is one of them. Not as an imposed law, but as the only stable foundation for freedom that does not collapse into chaos. Natural law does not dictate from outside. It is woven into reality itself. It is built into cause and effect. It is written into conscience. If we want peace, we cannot keep worshiping systems that require fear and division to survive. And that is why it matters. Not because I want to be provocative, not because I want to be right, but because in a world where care is consistently being redefined as obedience, The greatest spiritual work may simply be to remember what true care looks like and to live it with enough courage that it becomes contagious. I think voting is mind violence. Don't just hear, listen, and find meaning behind silence, 'cause my words walk a divine line, and when I told it, I thought you knew it. Truth precedes perception and conclusion. Foolish is the man who knows he's wise. Useless is the ungrounded. Stay rooted in truth, 'cause belief in government is mental illness. That's part addiction, part delusion. All deception, all collusion, all coercion, all inclusive. Everybody get a piece, government included. The system abuses the system and you, that's why my MP3 in. You turn to me to turn away from obedience to this matrix that keeps sheep sleeping. Here go a sleek sequence bridge to deep meanings. I forgive, but I learn too. Even when I got nobody to turn to. But if you too scared to serve hurt to the herd that hurts you and Erica Kirks you, don't stand in my way. And don't say I ain't warned you. When everybody in the world is playing the victim, blaming and bitching, praying and wishing, school teachers struggling to get them to listen, how can we be the change that pay for the vision? Well, most people rather never attempt at changing anything that threaten what they treasure about themselves, about the hood they represent, for better or for worse. The shit is pressure. A desire tend to fester in the purest hearts. Yeah, we fighting temptation uphill in the purest dark. 'Cause if you roll it up, then it's sure to spark. And vices can feel like a cure in art. It's like a shrink. So I pray these lyrics make you think. When you hurting on the brink, insanity may creep, but my flow wash it off into the sink. I clean it up, cleanse it out, and send a link. Kings was the old way. But government is king now, and we still keep that old flavor. Yeah, we all tax paying, serfs, paying to live on an abundant earth. Make it make sense like money in the church. They make us make rent with disregard for our worth and blame us for sins of their thirst in reverse. Spirit, speak to those refusing the light. I'm in tune to get truth infused with the mic, so get loose. Jet fuel is juiced for the flight. No set groove, skate free, get bruised, learn to fight. Get teased, learn to master the future. Get good at reflecting on mistakes of the abusers. False prophecy users, mind-controlled super troopers. Costumes don't grant rights to losers. Legal language don't create gods without an ego. It finesses the directors. Like counting cards at the casino, they remain deceptive with directives. Hush. I script in the infamy, feeling the lethargy. I'm connecting with divinity from the one to infinity. Heavenly amenities be hoarded by the enemies. Secrets of our chemistry, sea of synchronicity. Men and women get it, me be hating on my ministry. I break them up with entropy and kill them alchemically. Lyrical cellular reassembly, my lettering be menacing. A litany of written epiphany. I don't want to lessen the lessening like removing femininity from Trinity, so I'll get back to core messaging. Essentially, you hide your face behind your COVID mask, afraid to be exposed. There's evidence you met the inner portions of your soul and let it get corrupted for the fear of getting old, trying to kill your own reflection with the shadow from your clothes. But shadow work has made me see with greater clarity. The parody propaganda imposes on reality. The poses word fallacies encrypted with malice streams of frequencies disrupting the balance. See the hypocrisies? Sorry, that ain't a word. I break too many rules sometimes for my own good. I guess just ain't scared of thinking outside the box, even if telling the truth elevate me beyond the crops, making me a target for the barrels of evildoers. But awakening in the matrix means bullets can cease to move if I see the code and compute it. Teaching, coaching the youth and create a million anomalous neos, poaching the booster. Loudspeakers, the views, the influence produced. I'm cleansing cultural abuse, living open and blooming a future we want to see into existence, because you and me is the key to the new beginning. Forgiveness. Thank you very much.